Hello, folks. Welcome to Chapter 1 in our discussion of marketing strategy, starting with marketing in today's economy. I don't have to tell you this, folks. I know you know it for yourselves, but we live in what the Chinese used to say is interesting times. As I'm talking right now, it is May. We are in the heart of what we hope to be the narrowing down or the going to the tail end of the curve when it comes to the coronavirus. Many of the states have already started opening up, and we're hoping to see more open up as well. And so, given these situations, with all of the other things that we're dealing with right now, we look at marketing strategy as one of those disciplines more than ever in which we need to help our businesses start back on their feet again, okay? And so before even this times, it's important to understand that we lived in the challenging times before all of this started. And these are some of the things that, if you look at the last decade, that we have found to have happened. One of them is that we have found that there's been a power shift to consumers, with the ability of consumers to have endless information at their hands. Power, which is one of those things when one group can, in essence, engage their will over another, you find that that has moved to the consumer now, especially with the birth of the omni-channel, in which we'll talk about when we're talking about the basics of the 4 Ps. We've seen a massive increase in product selection, and that also has to go with the amount of information at our hands and our understanding the availability that our goods can be found globally now. We also find that we have a massive fragmentation of the market. I think this is more that we recognize that the market is fragmented, that it always has been. And what it takes a more selective drilling down to be able to talk to the consumers in which we wish. We also find a changing set of value propositions, those things that consumers find desirable above all things. Uniqueness, speciality, design, even though those are all important, we find that the glorification of the bottom dollar, the least amount of money expended, has become more important than ever. And along with that has also been a shift in demand patterns. An example with that would be just as simple as the ubiquitous movie rental. When I started out, we were basically renting in what were known as the magic of the videotape. As time moved on, we found that we moved to the DVD. And then ultimately now we are moving to rentals on our iPads. This is one of those major shifts, and it is our ability to anticipate these shifts ultimately that decides our success and failure in the world. We also find that privacy, security, and ethical concerns are now even higher on the consumer's mind more than ever. I find this to be really interesting because when I started doing my research when I was getting my dissertation, I was an IT guy. And it was always concerning to me how privacy was so important. Well, privacy really didn't come on the blip on the radar until the HIPAA Act of 2006, which was the Hospital Privacy Act, which basically said you could not broadcast this information without the current or a successful amount of security. Well, this is extended, of course, to the Child Act as well. And of course, if we look across the internet now, privacy concerns are bigger than ever. I talked about the COVID-19 cases right now. Let's also consider the fact that there are individual governments out there, state governments, who actually want to track you when it comes to your activity, whether or not you have COVID or not. These are the things that drive our economic situation and our ability to market effectively today. And the last one is unclear juris legislation, especially when you're talking about a global world. The rules and the mindset of an individual in other countries certainly is not the same as individuals in the United States. All of these have to come into play ultimately to determine how we go about achieving success based upon the challenges and opportunities of today's economy. Now, with so many different ubiquitous items out there right now, some of the major things we're facing, above all else, is the commodization with so many different products, okay? Commodization is a consequence of what is considered to be a very mature market. And we find that most of the markets that we're in right now generally are. So if I'm going to reach back here and I'm going to grab my phone, this is an LG phone. Now everybody has their favorite, LGs, Samsungs, iPhones. It depends on which you consider to be more desirable. Now my phone is not much different than yours, regardless of whether you have an iPhone or not. You have cameras on the back and in the front. I have a fingerprint recognition. You have a standard sizes of screen. I'm using Android versus iOS, but many of the same features and functions are the same. However, as I'm sitting here saying this now, it is the differences that make me like this phone versus my wife's iPhone. For one thing, I can take this phone, plug it into a computer, and it is in essence an effective thumb drive. I can also store in this my little SIM card in which I have 24 movies on it. That's another example. It is the fight against commoditization, spit it out, that is important and ultimately what we need to do in order to make our products unique and successful in today's world, okay? Realize that the planning by LG to come up with this design, similar to the planning that goes on in Apple, that goes on in Samsung, all of these require some form of effective planning and strategy to achieve the goals that LG wished to be able to have at this phone. By the very same function, this iPad that I have, this iPad has a unique operating system in and of itself, and it is different enough that it is unique from my particular phone, all right? It is the planning and the differences ultimately that hopefully help us to achieve our goals. And the difficulty, of course, in this real world today is that our economy is characterized by rapid technological change. There's a real financial anxiety. I don't even have to talk about that now. We're going to have that anxiety for the next dozen years, who knows? And there's an increasing consumer skepticism about the value of going with a brand name, no matter how great a value it is. There are many websites that you can find. No matter how many people love Apple, you will find many websites out there for individuals who can't stand them. All right? It's just the way it is, folks. All right. So, given this backdrop, I just thought I'd show you this. This is kind of an interesting study. This shows you the change in daily media usage by U.S. adults from 2010 to 2014, and we're only talking about a period of 4 years. And so if you notice, there is a significant drop in desktops, but I also think if you look at that, if you see the coincided use of tablets and smartphones, we've in essence seen major shift patterns in the last decade. Microsoft used to be proud of the fact that they owned 92% of all of the operating system environments on computers and PCs. The modern number for that, in terms of operating systems on technological environments, Microsoft only has about 1/3. Now think about that. Microsoft owned the market for almost 2 decades, and yet without their ability, well, no, I take that back. When we get to talk about products, I'll show you how Microsoft still could have made the day. But they allowed iPad to come along with their operating system. They allowed Android to come out with their operating system. And what they did was, instead of replacing the operating systems on the desktops, they replaced the desktops as devices of use. And that's what changed the world forever. And so if you look at this list here, you'll see magazines down by a third. This is 2014, and certainly that has come even further down from there. The uses, especially with smartphones, smartphone is in essence the linchpin or the starting point of what we in marketing strategy called the omni-channel. And that is the ability to have a proactive device that allows us to reach out and find what we would consider to be the best price out there. And so we see, as with everything, the world is changing. And the world is changing quite rapidly, and it's up to us as marketers to hopefully be able to hang on. Now, along with all of this as well, we must recognize the fact that we are losing privacy. However, the federal government is still doing its best to protect those that are innocents, that have the greatest vulnerability. And so the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act basically is out there to protect children under the age of 13 and keep, or in essence, do whatever they can to protect them from the more baser elements that are out on the internet. Okay? And so given this backdrop of where we are in the world today, let's kind of take a step back and let's go through some basic definitions of marketing that help us define strategy. Okay? And so, marketing for, 2 or 3 decades would come up with a new definition of what marketing is. The AMA would. Well, in 2007, they actually came up with a definition, and they've stuck with it now for 12 years or 13, and I think we're going to see this one stick. And so the original definition that I went to school with, marketing was the provision and efficient distribution of goods and services over a chosen consumer segment. That goes back to the original roots of marketing, which was a discipline that actually spun off from economics. Marketing was really literally that.
Daddy?
Excuse me, folks. Had a little problem come in. My little daughter. Okay? So, marketing's original definition came from economics, and it was more about how do we facilitate the moving of goods from the producer to the consumer. The 25 definition takes not that much into account. They talk about it as an organizational functions. The functions are the organizations, and define marketing as a series of processes that are about for creating, communicating, and delivering value to their consumers. Well, the 2007 definition moves in the same way, but they look at marketing as beyond just merely the narrow concepts of business, and they think of society at large as well. And so marketing is the activities, the set of institutions, and the processes for creating, communicating, delivering, and exchanging offerings. The big payoff word is coming up, that have value for customers, clients, partners, and society at large. Now, value has always been one of those items that between the value and satisfaction is to which one is more important when it comes to marketing. And you'll always find these kind of conversations going on. But I think it is the creation, identification of value that ultimately brings about satisfaction. And so we always talk about satisfaction as being one of those key indicators of whether or not a consumer will enter into a long-term relationship. Well, it's true, it is. But if we were to look at satisfaction, satisfaction is kind of a passive emotion, whereas dissatisfaction is not passive, it's actually a call to action. And so satisfaction is not necessarily one of those things that is something we can act upon, however identifying value is. Let me also say one of the other thing. Um, when was the last time you went to Walmart and were satisfied with it? I mean, was it an enjoyable experience? The truth is that in terms of a satisfying experience, no. Walmart ranks yearly as the lowest in terms of achieved customer satisfaction. Now, in 2018, Walmart had a 10% increase in satisfaction. They went up to 71%. In other words, 71% of all consumers were satisfied with their purchases at Walmart and satisfied with the overall experience. Why? Because in 2018, Walmart gave all 2.6 million employees a payroll hike. That's all it took to increase satisfaction. Now, having said that, Walmart never does well in satisfaction. However, it could also be argued that Walmart is number one when it comes to delivering value. And so perhaps it's not satisfaction that people are looking for, but they're really looking for value. And that ultimately may be Walmart's greatest contribution. All right? So let's once again wind back around and let's talk about definitions. What is a market? A market is basically a group of individuals or institutions with similar needs, okay, that can be met by a specific product. And so if I were to talk about the television market or the radio market, those would be considered markets. There is a defined need that groups consumers together, and it is the satisfaction of that defined need, whether it's by a product or by a service, ultimately that defines what the market is. Okay? Now, of course, we've gone on to other definitions now. We also have the concept of what's known as a market space, which is basically a marketplace on the internet that is unbound by time and space. And for any of you who have done any kind of searching for goods, especially like on Amazon, that kind of gives you an idea, okay? Now, you can also find that beyond just an individual product group, you find that there's some goods that are closely related that seem to go around a similar consumption activity. The classic example is electronics, all right? And so electronics is a very wide umbrella. It covers television, it covers recorders, it covers PCs, it covers smartphones, it covers a vast array of things. And so this is an example ultimately of what a meta market would be. And you do find that many times there's overlapping. As a matter of fact, PCs at one time would be considered to be their own unique market. However, you see the intrusion of PCs by, of course, smartphones and iPads, and you find sometimes, many times, is that the markets kind of interact with each other, okay? The last thing to consider is the advantage or the power of one single access point, such as a phone. And this is a metamediary. This is a single access point where buyers can locate and contact many sellers in the meta market. And this is the definition of where the omnichannel is right now. Now, the unique thing about the omnichannel is the omnichannel was customer driven. It was built by the consumers themselves, and it's one of those things that companies have had to react to and be able to compensate to in order to survive. And so examples here for spit it out, Dave, meta markets and metamediaries are websites such as Edmunds, Cars Direct, KBB, Kelley Blue Book, and you can look at the participants that come there. It's important also to understand is that there are specialized participants as well, and so you can't necessarily ever have a car dealership without having some form of payment. You can't have a car dealership without some form of advertisement. And so what you see ultimately is that metamediaries and meta markets tend to have participants that kind of come together, that use one single group, okay? Now, so we've talked about what a market is, but we've also got to talk about the purpose of what a market does. Markets exist to facilitate an exchange. All right? And so, where does the exchange come from? Well, back in 1776, while we were busy writing the Declaration of Independence, there was also another individual by the name of Adam Smith that had just produced a book called The Wealth of Nations. If George Washington could be called the father of our country, I'm very serious about this, Adam Smith could be called the mentor of our country. Adam Smith was a pen pal to Thomas Jefferson, to Benjamin Franklin. This is part of the time that's known as the Age of Enlightenment, where all sorts of fascinating, unique ideas were being tossed out. And one of the things that was in The Wealth of Nations that was perfect for the United States was the concept of wealth and what is wealth, all right? And so Adam Smith, one of the things that he said was, instead of investing in your life in something that was traditionally your grandfathers and your ancestors before you, he said that the best way or the success or the wealth of any nation is when the individuals in the country can do the things that they do best, receive money for those things, and exchange that money for other things from people who do those things better than they do. And so Adam Smith did not necessarily invent, but he formalized and facilitated the concept of the exchange economy. And so some of the things that he spelled out were, he spelled out the concept of what exchanges are. And so an exchange is the process of obtaining something of value by offering something in return. In a bartering society, what it meant also is that many times what was being exchanged was of a asymmetric value. In other words, many times in a bartering system, you did not exactly get for what you gave up. And so the concept of money is a very advanced kind of concept. We need money in order for a modern society, an advanced society, to be able to prosper. It's always kind of funny to me in Star Trek where they basically do away with money. And I know why they do that is quite simply because they came up with devices which can create anything out of thin air. So I understand that as a plot point. However, there was one unique show in which one of the people there wanted to get his father a Willie Mays baseball card, but he didn't have money. And so the whole show was there kind of this facilitation of bartering, going back and forth between to be able to get this one card. However, if they would have had money, there would have been a way of doing this. I'm sure if I were to say this, all of you who were in my fifth grade class with Sister Agnes when she was talking about money would know what this means. I'm sure that you've had your civics class and you know what this is. What are the three properties of money? Money is a unit of exchange, it is a store of value, and it is a measure of wealth. And so money facilitates the exchange process, of which we could never truly trade and get exactly what we want for exactly what we should give up. Okay, going on. So what are the conditions of an exchange? The first thing is that there must be two parties to be able to exchange. It means that those two parties can consist of one individual or a group of individuals. It doesn't matter. It's just that there are two parties. That individual who wishes something and those individuals who wish to give it up. The second is that each party has something that the other party wants. Okay, in other words, I want this money, here is my good. And also is that the exchange is something of equal or greater value. Now, it can also be said is that the money has much greater value for someone else, even if the property value is less, because the need for that is also something that takes into account. Each party has to be able to communicate and deliver that value in the exchange, and then each party must be free to accept or reject the exchange, otherwise it's coercion. And then finally, each party must believe it is desirable to exchange with the other party. as you can see, just in the very musing of that, the success of exchange all boils down to the voluntary nature of the exchange. Both sides must be willing to exchange, and both sides must be satisfied with the exchange as well. When we discuss a product in the terms of marketing, and in general, a product is anything that a consumer would want through an exchange to satisfy a need or a want. Now, I separate those two, and we'll talk about needs and wants a little bit more, but let me just define a need and a want, okay? A need tends to be the difference between your actual state and your desired state. This is a psychology definition, all right? I have my actual state here, and this is my desired state. This is what I would like to be. I am thirsty. I need something to drink. I am satiated, all right? And it is this difference that creates a need. A want is for something very specific. I want a Coke, something that'll not only quench my thirst, but it'll give me that little sugar and caffeine kick at the same time. That's an example of a want. Now, what are the differences in terms of what can be a product? The answer is anything, all right? Goods, services, ideas, information, and we'll talk about these more when we go on to be a product. When I was working as a consultant for an ISP, or when companies wanted to start up ISPs, I sold my time at $60 an hour as a consultant when they would ask questions. That's an example. I did not have any goods to sell, but I had knowledge to sell, all right? Anything that fulfills a need can be considered, or a want, can be considered a product. Now, in the product itself, the ability to satisfy a consumer's need or want ultimately also talks about the distinguishing or unique characteristics that bring value. I'm really not a great fan of the word utility, because utility is an economic concept. However, since we're in this and we're using OC's definition, OC Farrell, we're going to go ahead with what they say. Okay? All right. So, there are 4 types of utility, all right? One of them is what's called a form utility. And the form utility means that the product has a unique distinguishing attribute that ultimately makes it desirable. Not only that, but by changing the form of something, I can make it more valuable. And so if I were to take bananas and I were to take pudding and I were to create a banana pudding, the sum of the whole is going to be much greater than the sum of the parts. And so that's an example of creating a form utility. A time utility is when a product is available when the customer wants it at an exact time. This is also an example of how the value that Amazon and FedEx before it created value to any situation. A contract that has to be at a certain location before noon the next day has no value whatsoever if it fails to meet that goal. And yet, if it can get on my desk before 10:30 the next day, I will pay almost anything to make sure that it gets there. The next is place utility, and this is when a product is available when a consumer wants it. And of course, an example of this would be movable storage. And so my sister, this was a dozen years ago, it flooded in a place called Slidell, Louisiana. And what she did was, instead of sending it to the local warehouse, what she did was she called Pods up. And Pods, in essence, she loaded all of her things in that, and they literally picked up the goods and moved it to wherever she wanted to be. Possession utility has to deal with the ability for you to easily transfer ownership or title of a good to another. So an example of that If any of you have ever gone to an automobile dealership and you bought your own car, all right, one of the first things that they'll do is if they see you coming up and they think you really like this car, is they're going to say, why don't you drive that home for the weekend? And so what they'll do is they'll let you drive it home for the weekend. So guess what? You're already getting married to the car. And when you come in on Monday, they will have said, look, we have figured out you've got a $4,000 trade-in value on the car. We've run it through the shop. We've got the contract signed out here. They will check and make sure they'll know what your income is, and they'll make sure that they know what payments you did that reach to. And they go, well, you can have the car for $199. Why don't you, in essence, give you the pen to sign. That's an example of possession utility. All right. The last is psychological utility, and that is a product that provides experiential attributes that the customers find satisfying. If I had one of my masks in here right now, and you know what I mean, whenever I go anywhere, I wear a mask, and just by having that mask, I feel in some way or another safer than I would have been without it.